Hey y'all, this is Wit. I'm doing the neg-util topic analysis for the Jan-Feb topic about United States military aid to authoritarian regimes. This is to be used as a broad level overarching introduction to negative util slash consequentialist arguments on the topic. As always, you should use this as a springboard, not the basis for all of your preparation, especially considering this is the TOC topic, and with the most big tournaments of any topic by a good deal. This topic will definitely become very developed in depth, and so you should be working on active research and use what this topic analysis covers to help guide you there. Um, to start off, uh, there are a few core responses that are in common to most of the negative arguments within the literature regarding military aid. They can tend to be split up into two broader categories. One is propping up slash supporting allies. This tends to cover responses meant to defend the United States and build up hard and soft power across important regions within the geopolitical sphere in order to protect U.S. interests. Um, a few specific parts of this. One is containing threats. This started largely as a Cold War policy to prevent the spread of communism. The United States took on what's now called, or was called back then, the Containment Plan, um, where the United States explicitly worked to prop up regimes and governments to protect them against encroaching communism by Russia, as well as other nations. Um, Obviously, now we support regimes for other reasons than just that. Um, but essentially, by giving countries defensive and offensive military weapons, um, it helps deter attacks on them that may be harmful to the United States. Even if the government is not exactly a government we want to be allied in the first place, it's considered net better than some alternative. This is also used in the context of the War on Terror, a justification for a lot of the United States' um, arms sales as well as military aid are two countries with the express and implied purpose of helping support the crackdown on terrorists, including but not limited to um, Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, ISIS slash ISIL. This is a bit questionable, and a lot of people in the literature critique it as being largely unnecessary. Given the scale of terror attacks and the true threat they pose to the United States, it's much smaller than the amount of money we give them. But nonetheless, this is a pretty common justification made in literature. Additionally, regional stability, as well as building up allies, uh, in a lot of times when the government makes decisions, it's not necessarily a choice between any desirable outcome, uh, but uh, least bad one is chosen. The United States, for various economic, political, military reasons, finds it important to have allies in places like the Middle East, Asia, Southern America, across the globe, essentially. Um, and one way to do that is to make sure they stay in power by giving our allies weapons. We're able to help forge ties, which protects us in the case of an attack. But it's also important to prevent regions from being overly hostile to the United States by propping up powers that are supportive of us. Additionally, it helps deter conflict in places both close and far to us. This is sort of encompassed partially in previous sub points I've just discussed. Um, but essentially, the theory of deterrence is that by having a lot of countries that support us around the globe, it helps deter attacks on us because they know if we have people with missiles, bombs, etc., that are near them and can help protect and create counterattacks in the case that they're necessary. Um, None of these should be taken at face value. A lot of authors explicitly criticize really the efficacy of arms sales for a lot of these. But when talking about preserving sort of national security, these tend to be in the general area of those justifications. The second major subset of justifications is building up leverage and protecting national interests and international interests as opposed to security. The difference is this is not just protecting us from military attacks, but explicitly trying to build up soft power, leverage on other countries. This is often used as a justification for authoritarian regimes. Even if we're not allied with them, being able to have that power of saying, we're going to stop providing you with arms, um, or provide people arms in the case that they're willing to change governmental structures, um, and that sort of thing. Arms sales are an important bargaining chip, um, and the United States takes that position a lot. It does this a few ways: buying influence, saying we'll give you arms sales if um, you create these human rights reforms, if you do X, Y, or Z that are in our interests. It helps promote things like trade deals, uh, as I said, human rights, as well as a lot of other regional and international and national interests the United States has. It helps build bilateral ties. Um, when the government gives people uh, a lot of military aid and they're heavily reliant on that, that means they can't just easily say, we're going to be allied with China now. For example, Israel, who we give, I think, upward, I don't know the exact number, but a very large amount of military aid, has explicitly said if the United States says we don't want you to engage with China in trade, they're essentially beholden to the United States. And having the ability to use arms sales as a bargaining chip helps in those situations and negotiations where it's necessary. Obviously, Israel is questionable whether it's actually an authoritarian country, but that can sort of be extrapolated to a lot of places that are much more clearly authoritarian. For example, in places like Saudi Arabia, even though uh, they're not the sort of idea of a country you'd want to be allied with, having that sort of leverage and being able to say, unless you do X, Y, or Z, we will stop funding you, helps protect us from and helps giving us leverage. This is often used in exchange for things like UN votes, bases in countries, which are important for strategic military interests because it gives us places where we can deploy missiles, troops, etc. These aren't enough to build up a whole disad or counterplan or that sort of thing, but they sort of form the building blocks for a lot of other arguments I'm going to cover in a second. First, this is the executive self-restraint or ESR Counter Plan and war powers disad. This is one of the most common arguments in college policy right now, which is a different topic, but also about foreign policy. Uh, the counterplan essentially says the executive, i.e., the president, should basically stop providing arms or military aid or other sorts of military assistance to authoritarian countries. Uh, the power to do so rests largely in the executive. They're the ones who make the deals through the Department of State, the State Department, through treaties and that sort of thing. Well, a lot of those are subject to congressional approval. If Trump says, I want to stop selling arms to Saudi Arabia or stop providing military assistance to Afghanistan, he largely has the power to do so. And the counterplan, through various mechanisms, some binding, some not binding, would say that Trump stops doing so. Of course, there's a politics net benefit, as do any sort of branch counterplan. It would, instead of having Congress say, we're preventing the president from making deals with authoritarian countries, which Congress also has the power to do so. If the executive chooses not to, that deflects a lot of authority, a lot of backlash. There's also a war powers disad, which is very common on most foreign policy topics with the ESR counterplan. It has a lot of different impact scenarios, but essentially it says that limiting the scope of what the executive can do through congressional oversight is bad. It decreases flexibility. It sets a precedent that restricts what the president can do in the future, etc. All of those, when geopolitical actions and military responses require quick action, the executive being able to have credible threats that are unencumbered by Congress, and that sort of thing, all rely on the executive having power, which means leaving that authority to decide to do so with Trump, even if fiat makes it like durable, um, has an important perceptual advantage. Another very common argument I think we can expect to see is the fill-in Assad. Essentially, what this says is, regardless of whether the United States is providing military assistance, demand for it will still exist. The United States is not the only country that produces arms, has troops, large militaries, etc. So the question is, what happens when the United States stops supplying them? It's not like this demand goes away. A lot of the literature is about how China, Russia, and other countries, including U.S. allies like France, have the capabilities and might be willing to fill in uh, for that gap in support in place of the United States. For example, last year, after Saudi Arabia got frustrated by export controls on military drones, Saudi Arabia just started purchasing them from China. So it's not simply a question of should we be supporting authoritarian regimes, but the secondary question is what happens if we don't, because it's not as clear cut that they just won't have support. It's not like Saudi Arabia isn't able to find weapons, though to the scale of what the United States supplies them, it's certainly questionable whether China would be willing to do so, or Russia. But there's certainly a very hearty debate on that topic. And additionally, this is pretty strong defense if on the affirmative if won, because a lot of advantages will probably rely on, for example, Saudi Arabia needing arms for the supporting the Yemen war. If you win that China or Russia or another country supplies those arms, not only does it give you an advantage through hedge, different impact scenarios, etc., but it also means that the affirmative loses access to pretty crucial impact arguments. Additionally, the politics debate. I've referenced this some above. Uh, this is a much more nuanced debate than I think a lot of topics are. Uh, I don't think you'll be able to get away, at least against good debaters, with just having some poll that says the plan is popular among the public, the plan is not popular. There are a few reasons for this. One, just in general, people's views of things in the abstract don't necessarily correlate to their reactions to the impacts of specific things. For example, jobs and industry are highly affected by arms sales. Defense contracting, which includes countries like Lockheed Martin, employ a very large number of people in order to produce weapons, provide support, all of that sort of thing. And those companies all support a lot of people in providing them jobs, helping the economy, etc. The Atlantic wrote an article about essentially how one way Trump has effectively capitalized on the largely left opposition to arms sales is that by sorry, the Atlantic essentially argues that arms sales are an important part of building up support for Trump because they're able to retain blue collar jobs, and by just decimating that industry, which is debatable whether it would happen. That will be covered on the econ debate, but it gives Republicans an important talking point, slash hurts their base to have those jobs go away. And so that debate is certainly a lot more in-depth than just is it popular in the abstract. Once it starts to involve people who have jobs and reside in a ton of different districts. This relates to the next argument, which is the industry. The defense contracting industry is extremely powerful. Their lobbying spends on average about $100 million a year over the past decade. And so through this industry, and its lobbying efforts, has a lot of power over senators. Speaking out against arms sales and military aid means they can lose important financial support, be subject to attack ads, as well as a lot of other opposition, which, even if it's not reflected in polls or whether the public likes the plan in the abstract, um, means that it does have significant implications. They wouldn't be spending $100 million a year if they didn't believe their efforts had some chance of being successful. And the fact that a lot of senators and representatives are highly beholden to the industry shows that there is a significant risk to them presumably voting against it were the plan to pass. That said, uh, public opinion obviously does matter some. Uh, it's hard as an in the large abstract to say um, any one way because there are a lot of different plans, different ways you could specify. In general, um, the at least in specific engagements, recently Saudi Arabia military support has been highly criticized. A majority of people in both major parties oppose continued arms sales to them. That obviously doesn't tell the whole story. Um, but there is a large amount of public opposition, and people don't generally like the idea of supplying arms to authoritarian countries. And just intuitively, it's harder to defend just on face without any information behind it. Um, so it's a more nuanced debate than I think a lot of topics where there's less of a base because politics is highly intertwined with the defense industry. So you should be aware of that. The economy, this touches somewhat on what I was talking about on the politics slide, but defense contracting is a big business. A whole lot of money is spent by the government on arms, both for the U.S. military and for foreign countries. Um, this is through both just us giving direct aid, i.e., us just providing weapons, and countries like Saudi Arabia, Israel, and other major countries we supply arms to, who purchase it. Uh, for example, Saudi Arabia, Trump has been touting $120 billion in deals. This is a highly questionable figure. Only about 10-ish billion from the most recent statistics I've seen have actually materialized. Um, but even though it's not as big as Trump may say, even individual countries can translate to a whole lot of American jobs. For example, the bomb, just providing a single type of bomb to Saudi Arabia, employs I think around 1,000 Americans, according to a statistic I saw. Which means just for one weapon in one country, if you extrapolate that to all of our foreign commitments, is a lot of money that could be going to the economy. It would lead to a lot of layoffs, uh, reduced GDP, etc., which arguably would have a significant impact on the economy. This is more questionable than I think my explanation might have made it sound. Uh, it's unclear how much it actually does contribute to the economy. Military procurement does not actually provide a lot of jobs, dollar for dollar compared to other industries and ways the government spends its money. For example, just providing one. For example, a lot of one specific weapon, vehicle, or that sort of thing may cost a lot of money. It does not take nearly as many jobs to provide something like an airplane or fighter jet. Um, so it's questionable whether dollar for dollar it's actually the best use of government spending, or if that money could go to better uses. Negatives should probably argue that even if there are better uses, it still leads to layoffs. Someone who builds uh, armored tanks probably isn't able to just suddenly switch to some other job in a completely different industry. Additionally, spec AFs will be very small. Um, a lot of them, for example, if you're talking about a country we provide about like $1 million, $2 million in military aid to, obviously $1 million or $2 million of government spending is not nearly make or break for the economy, and even amounts much larger than that can be disregarded with relatively negligible effects. So it's questionable whether this ad truly has a lot of truth, and probably most of the literature I've seen so far says it's wrong. Um, but there are certainly authors who argue for the negative, so you should be prepared for that debate, and it's certainly a position that could be viable. This, as I mentioned at the start, there are a lot of different possible AFs. The best case neg to an AF about Afghanistan is different from Iraq, is different from Egypt, is different from Saudi Arabia. The best, I think, case negs will have arguments specific to each country. Obviously, the figures I'm seeing people post in Slack are around 52 to 60 different countries classified as authoritarian, and it's hard to put case next to all of those. Um, but starting out negative research, a lot of these countries are not much aid. In the grand scheme of things, countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt take up a very large number and portion of that aid, which means it's not too hard to prioritize and just consider which apps are most likely. And you should, before the first tournament, devote a good amount of time to those. You should use this as a springboard, especially the core arguments I talked about at the beginning of the slideshow. Most arguments will arise somewhat from those responses, whether it's Saudi Arabia key to fight terror, it's building alliances with Egypt are key to regional stability. Uh, Most arguments in the literature will probably arise from some relation to those, but contextualized to specific countries and scenarios. So you should be prepared for those and look into things like picks, dissets to specific scenarios, etc., which should form the basis for a relatively strong case neg to most AVs on this topic. As always, make sure to check out the other topic analyses, especially the AF-util one, if you're interested in this, as there will definitely be a lot of overlap in responses to these arguments from the affirmative side that I didn't cover. See y'all.